Mission Chats with Jon Crowe.
Welcome back to Mission Chats. This is the third and final episode of my chat with Brooks Buser with Radius International. I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the other two if you haven't already. That'll help give a little bit of perspective on this story that I'm about to lead off with, but also a little more insight into where Brooks is coming from personally and the ministry that he leads and how they encourage people into missions. Looking back to the time with the Yembi Yembi, I mean, I know from following your updates, there were many stories of God doing miraculous things. Is there one of those experiences that just stands out for you, from your family, from your experience there?
Oh man, the day we presented the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, just again thinking about Easter and what that means to Christians down through the centuries, we presented the gospel and God was very gracious to us. It took us about 3 hours to get from the teaching of the death and the burial to the resurrection. And in the midst of that, a big storm was coming at us. And in that context, the average temperature is about 110, maybe 115 every day, 90% humidity. But if a rainstorm comes through, it'll drop to the low 90s and everybody will start shivering just because their body moves to the temperature being so hot. But they would have all headed back to their houses to warm up around the fire. And we saw this rainstorm coming, and the missionary team that was there, we all huddled together and we prayed in between the crucifixion and the resurrection before we got to the teaching of the resurrection that God would just hold off this storm, that we would be able to keep our audience with us. And in his great grace, we saw this storm kind of split in two, and we saw rain on our left and we saw rain on our right. And where the teaching house was, no rain hit. And even the people that were kind of against what we were doing were just like, this is kind of unique. This doesn't happen every day. And it's just a reminder to me that this is not a man-centered work. This is a God-centered work. And when it comes time, our God is faithful. He will be there for his people. He will be there for his own glory. And so that was just a really heartening experience for all of us. It felt like we were living in an eternal moment, so to speak. So anyways, that was
Yeah, I love that. A good word there for sure. Now, something else I always enjoy hearing from my guests, and this differs widely from person to person, but how would you describe missions from your experience?
I think John Piper does well. If your audience hasn't read Let the Nations Be Glad, I think Let the Nations Be Glad, especially chapter 5, he gets into goers and senders. And I think he takes that from Romans 10:13 through 15. And he looks at how Paul slices the missionary endeavor into goers and senders. And then I would probably slice the goers into 4 slices if you're looking at church planting as the main criteria. And I wrote an article about this recently, to where your 4 primary thrusts within church planting are, number 1, the education of pastors overseas. We've been blessed in the English-speaking world. Never in the history of the world have so many good Bible resources been brought together, been written under one language as they are right now in our day and age. And so to train other pastors that are coming out of other backgrounds, that's lane number 1. Lane number 2, English-speaking churches overseas. There's great Portuguese churches, great Spanish-speaking churches, but as far as churches that affect major cities, kind of hubs, the Antiochs, the Jerusalems, the Romes of the world today, there's some really dynamite good English. There's some really bad ones too, but there's some good ones. And then lane number 3 is national languages. So like Arabic, Mandarin, Bahasa, Urdu, Hindi. These are national languages where we need more churches in these languages. And then the 4th one is kind of what Radius specializes in, is these minority languages that have no church, no gospel, and many times no translated scriptures in their language. Those are your 4 primary lanes in missions today, if the church is primary. Mm-hmm. If the church is something to where they're going to help, they're going to drill wells, they're going to help with human trafficking, those are all good things, but they have to find their termination, their main thrust in the church. If the church is not primary, then that's not good missions. And so I'm really going to advocate for those 4 lanes. And then obviously lane number 4, we have a deep passion for down at Radius, because that's what we do. But those to me that's how I would maybe condense missions down.
I love that. First time I'm hearing that. So appreciate you expanding on that. That's great. And I'm sure it'll be interesting for the audience to to think through as well, and great book recommendation too. Then lastly, I always love to hear, and I think you're in a unique place to speak into this, but for some, let's call them a young person who feels the Lord's calling them into missions, or maybe not quite sure what that looks like. How would you advise someone to pursue and figure out if that really is what the Lord has for them?
Yeah, I would say three things. Number one, let your church know. Be a faithful member of your local church enough to where the elders know that you want to go into missions. This shouldn't be between you and Jesus. There's a lot of college students that hear a David Platt message, a John Piper. I love both those brothers. They're good friends. But to hear a message and then go, I want to go into missions without letting your local church know, that's really not going to be helpful long term, because the genesis of missions, the beginning of missions, starts with the local church. And as I was mentioning, the end point of missions is the local church as well. Mm-hmm. You want to see a church planted. So let your church know at the beginning part of that, rather than them being passengers, willing or unwilling on your book. And so that's number one. Number two, I would read good books. We talked about one, Let the Nations Be Glad. I would also read To the Golden Shore by Courtney Anderson. That's the story of Adoniram Judson. That's probably the best missions biography ever written. The second best is the autobiography of John Paton, Paton. That's a fabulous book. And then for the ladies out there, Amy Carmichael, Beauty for Ashes by Ian Murray. That's just a wonderful book. It's a short read. I would start reading these books. We can learn so much from others who went ahead of us. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but learn from the mistakes, learn from the victories, learn from the way that they loved God. Mm-hmm. And then number three, I would make sure that you are actively evangelizing in the neighborhood, in the job, in the college group, in the fraternity, sorority that God has placed you in. If the idea of sharing your faith is just when you get to the mission field, brother, sister, you shouldn't go into missions. You should be an active evangelist now. That doesn't mean that I would probably not recommend this, but you're on the street corner on some sort of a box giving a message, but you're faithful with your friends. You have an agenda. You have a plan in mind to get these people to church, to let them hear the gospel for the first time. They will not go to hell because you didn't share the gospel with them. You did share the gospel with them. You gave them every opportunity possible to understand the God of the ages. And so those three things, if you've got young people that are thinking about missions, man, I would put those three DNA into work and then see what the Lord does with it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. A real good word. Going to be helpful for those who hear this. So thank you, Brooks. Appreciate that. As we kind of wrap this one up, is there anything else that comes to mind that you would like to share with those listening?
Yeah, the other thing, if I was adding one thing to young people, and then I'm going to add for pastors as well, is good conferences. There's a lot of mediocre conferences out there. For young people, I think the Cross Conference is a great conference to go to. And then I would plug the Missions Conference that's coming up in October 16th through 18th. Pastors and potential missionaries, that is the beating heart of that conference. And so myself and some of the friends, so John Piper will be there, Mark Dever will be there, Sinclair Ferguson. There'll be some brothers from Europe that are coming. There's just Kevin DeYoung, who I have a deep affection for. These men will all be speaking. And then my own wife will be leading a panel and a breakout on women in missions. And then we'll have some friends from overseas in Dubai that are coming. They'll speak on Amy Carmichael. It's going to be an incredible conference. We're really looking forward to it. So I would press that at missionary.net. You can find out more about that conference, but good conferences they spark something. You're around other believers. You sing good songs. Your eyes are raised up just a little bit. So that would probably be a final word.
Yeah, fantastic. Appreciate that. And then lastly, if someone wants to find out a little bit more about Radius, what channels do you have? What's the best way?
Radiusinternational.org. And we have these regular visit days where once a semester, the next one coming up is going to be in November. I think it's November 10th and 11th, but where students and pastors come down to visit and they get to see what is this place that does these things the way that they do. So that would be a great opportunity. We'll also be at the missionary conference. We'll have a big night event where anybody who registered can come to the night events. But yeah, the radiusinternational.org and the Radius Days, those tend to be really helpful. Seeing it in person is like black and white. It's really hard to explain unless you see it.
Thank you. So Brooks, thank you for your time today. It's been as always, an encouragement to hear from you, and to do that in person is just a whole lot of fun. So thank you for carving the time out. And yeah, look forward to having this one available for my listeners to understand and learn a bit more about Radius and your own story.
Glad to do it, John. Yeah, good to see you again. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for making the time to listen to this little podcast. I hope that this conversation with Brooks Buser has been a real encouragement to you. And please, as always, if you know someone who might be interested, pass this on for their encouragement as well. It would also be a huge help if you could just take a moment to rate this podcast, hopefully with 5 stars. If you've been enjoying it, you should be able to do that through your podcast player or maybe directly on the podcast platform that you have.
Find us online at missionchats.com.